How you doing, Martin?
Yeah, pretty good. Bit melting. But
Melting, of course, as you would be. How's isolation been treating you?
Yeah, it's been all right, really. I've just moved to a high risk area in the UK, which is fun.
So you're trapped at home at the minute?
Yeah, pretty much. Even though our nearest supermarket's half a mile away, but apart from that, trapped at home.
Great, very good. What episode are we? What episode would this be?
Episode 8.
Episode 8.
Yeah, episode 8. We've done it 2 months now.
God damn, 2 months. We had 2 months just together, sitting doing this podcast. Are you starting to get a bit? Is it starting because we've relaxed to like a 2-week schedule? As it was getting a bit too much for you?
I think it has been starting to get to me a little bit. I think, if anything.
But you're fond of me podcast, ain't ye? I seen it. You're fond of me podcast. Say it. Say it. Say it.
I refuse to engage in this. I know what you're doing here.
Damn ye! Let Neptune strike ye dead, Martin's low. Hark! Hark, Triton, hark! Bellow bid our father, the Sea King, rise from the depths full foul in his fury. Black waves teeming with salt foam to smother a young mouth in pungent slime. And choke ye, engorging your organs till ye turn blue and bloated with the bilge and brine and can scream no more. Only when he, crowned in cockle shells with slithering tentacle talons, steaming beard and take up his beefing arm. His coraltine trident screeches banshee like in the tempest and plunges right down through your gullet, bursting ye, a bursting bladder no more, but a blasted bloody film now and nothing with the heartbeats and souls of dead podcasters to peck and claw and feed, only to be lapped up and swallowed by the infinite waters of the iTunes Apple Store itself. Forgotten to any man, to any time, forgotten to any god or devil or Steve Jobs, forgotten even to the sea. For any stuff of part of Martin's Low, for any scantling of your soul is Martin's Low no more, but now itself, the sea.
Woof.
And the bit I had written for you that I was going to share with you was you ended that by saying, all right, have it your way, I like your podcast. But anyway, here's the Lighthouse. Afternoon or morning, not necessarily in that order, and welcome to Movies and Martins, a sometimes weekly film podcast hosted by two boys called Martin. Yes, that is, as always, the one and only gimmick we have. Two boys who studied English at university for a long time and don't want to let those critical thinking, or whatever you call it, degrees that we did, and all the crushing student debt we accrued from it go to waste. So welcome back. That's quite a downer to start on, but yeah, welcome back to our...
It's on brand for what we're discussing, I suppose.
And I am joined this week by the one, the only, dread Emperor of the Sea himself, Mr. Martin Shaw.
And I am joined, as ever, via the medium of the internet, by the lost Lovecraftian luminary, the mouth from the south, Martin Ducati.
That's very good.
Thank you.
See, I realised I had a couple of other options. I had bulging bladder no more, Mr. Martin Shaw. I'm joined this week by forgotten to any god or devil, Mr. Martin Shaw.
I guess we should tell them this week we're talking about The Lighthouse.
It's Robert Eggers's. I think it's like a masterfully put together film about queerness, about masculinity, about Hegelian philosophy, about really horrible looking seagulls, and Robert Pattinson having a wank lots of times in the film. And mermaid sex as well.
Yeah.
So that's the film we're talking about today. So if that hasn't served enough as a content warning for you, if any of those things might make you uncomfortable, including bodily horror,
violent animal abuse as well.
Do seagulls count as animals, Martin? Or are they enemies? Because to this podcast, Martin Shaw, for the family of seagulls who live directly outside of my window when we record, seagulls are the enemy.
Seagulls are deep state plants.
Seagulls are horrific creatures. I once went to a school field trip to Warmer Castle nearby. Some kid took out his packed lunch, and a seagull flew down and picked up the whole bag and flew away with it across the ocean. So this kid started crying as the seagull flew away with his plastic bag full of lunch. I saw this film back when it sort of was towards the tail end of its airing in the UK. I went to watch it. I've talked about this in the last episode we did about socially distant cinema, but I went to watch this film in the Palace Cinema, which is an old, small listed building, so it's a very old. I think it was around in the Victorian era at one point. I don't know if it was a cinema back then still, but it might have been like a little theatre. But it sits right down, sort of just at the edge of the promenade, and just along the seafront. And it's literally like a 2-minute walk, and you're in the waters of the sort of southeast coast along there. I went to watch it with my mum and my little brother in the evening. Not a film to take your Catholic mum to, this one, as a side note. But as we sort of settled into this kind of old, sort of antique, kind of a bit rundown cinema, you could hear the caws of the seagulls across the night air as you settled into it, and then watch this film about isolation, about confrontation, and about lots of really sort of unsettling themes and sort of obscurest but inviting vagaries in its plot. And you come outside, and as you step outside and watching this film, you're hit by the sea air, and sort of watching them, sort of the moon kind of come up and reflect across the sea. So I found it a really enchanting, quite enthralling experience, and I sort of like it as this kind of very open puzzle box of different themes all wrapping together in this beautifully tonal experience. And yeah, it's about Robert Pattinson going to an island with Willem Dafoe, who's the lead wiki or lighthouse keep, and the kind of horrible, drunken, Lovecraftian misadventures they get up to together on this lighthouse. So what were your first thoughts about it? Because you obviously watched it yesterday. So what was your kind of initial takeaways from it? Because you weren't quite as positive going in on it than I was, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so it's on the list of things that I definitely kind of passed me by, but are things that I'm like, I should go back and watch this at some point. And it was something I needed to go and watch because of all the buzz that was around it in terms of criticism and things like that. So I was going to go watch it at some point. But I found myself several times just sort of wiggling the mouse on my laptop and being like, there's still an hour and 20 minutes left. Oh God, there's still an hour left. Oh God, we still got half an hour left. I'm very confounded by it. It's a very conflicted opinion, I think, overall, in that I think that it's a very accomplished film. It achieves a lot of things that it sets out to do, and it shows off that that Robert Eggers is a very, very cinema literate and very capable director, and everyone else who worked on this film clearly are very talented people because they've achieved something very impressive. But for me, The Lighthouse felt like a film that you endured and confronted rather than necessarily enjoyed.
I can definitely see that, yeah. So what do you think about it that you kind of bounced off in particular? Because you say, so it was kind of like this kind of specific bleakness about it.
Yeah, so I'll hold off on it because I want to discuss it a bit more when we get into like picking things apart. But just generally, I found it almost too bleak to actually get involved in and get sort of immersed in, because there's a lot of things that it does to try and really draw you in to this like very small locale and this very sort of insular community, so that effectively you become like the third person who's working at this lighthouse, like isolated little rock lighthouse. But I think I found it just literally too oppressive. And again, that feeds back into being like, it's clearly very good and it does what it wants to do because that's the mood it wants to create. But also, I think it's almost
not for you.
From that, it became quite a difficult one to sit through.
Before we jump into The spoiler zone, Martinslow. If you don't care about spoilers, whatever, carry on with us. If you do care about spoilers, go away, watch the film, come back and listen to the rest of this. But to try and sell you on it, if you're not sure about the film and you're listening to this, Robert Pattinson saw Eggers' 2015 film The Witch.
I'd seen The Witch, Robert's previous movie, like when it was in theatres, I think, and loved it. And I wanted to work with him. I met him about a couple of other projects, and they were really great, but I think both the parts he wanted me to do were period parts. And I sort of quite flippantly said at the end of one of the meetings, I was like, look, basically all I want to do is that stuff that's like really, really weird and crazy. And the next day he said, like, oh, yeah, me and my brother are working on this thing, like, and I think if this isn't crazy enough, like, I don't know what to tell you. And I read it.
And then Robert Pattinson goes back and goes,
this is pretty wild.
That it was.
So let's enter into
The
spoiler zone, Wilmslow. Come down to the depths of the sea. Alright, we open to grayscale seas and oppressive booming foghorns. Retired lumberjack Ephraim Winslow, played by Robert Pattinson, arrives on a remote islet off the coast of implied late 1800s New England to fill an assistant position on the islet's lighthouse. In his new role, he joins grotty and gassy Thomas Wake, played by Willem Dafoe, the lead wiki of the lighthouse. Throughout his time there, Winslow is abused and degraded throughout his posting by Wake, and as he begins to unravel under the blistering aura of Wake's charisma and derangement, he begins to wonder just what is at the top of that lighthouse. So I was wondering if, fresh off a hot new rewatch of a very cold and sad film, I was wondering if you had any like blistering hot takes you want to sort of lay down on us. Sort of what was your kind of thoughts coming away from the film, apart from that was long, seagulls and arsehole.
I guess my biggest takeaway is just, like I was saying, it's very well put together. I mean, the production and the cinematography were praised at length when it was released, when it was at film festivals, because I believe it premiered at Cannes. And
it did, and Sundance it was at as well. You can sort of see, it's one of these films where you can very clearly see the hand of an auteur, and it's not an annoying one.
So I think the first note I wrote down for word for word, I'm reading it right now, it just says, diegesis for me is working wonders. And by that I mean the wind, the sound of machinery in the lighthouse,
the foghorn,
and this like almost low, distorted sort of hum version of it almost.
Well, I think it's like they bleed they do this really cleverly in various ways. They don't have music as such in the film. They more have kind of ambient noise, and some of that is in kind of a slightly melodic form. And I think sometimes, basically, from what I can gather, they kind of bleed the foghorn sound as this very low, rumbling synth or distorted bass note that kind of carries on throughout the scene, is occasionally like broken up by the pitter-patter of machines that kind of, they form their own rhythm and beat to it. If that makes sense.
And it all sort of coheres to this very deliberate, precisely injected and really oppressive soundscape that really, the absence of any sort of music or sound that doesn't belong inside the film to some degree really lends itself well to building this just really tight, constrictive atmosphere that,
which is, of course, brought in as well in terms of the coherence with the visual aspect of it.
And sort of in tandem with that soundscape, you also get these really beautiful images of the sort of really sort of grand and sort of classically gothic and sublime landscape of this tiny remote islet from Nova Scotia that they filmed almost the entire thing on. And it was so iconic to this landscape that the people from nearby villages fought to get it. The lighthouse, which was a built structure for the film, they fought to keep it there.
Oh, is the lighthouse a built structure? I didn't realise this.
So every part of it is either filmed on site around the lighthouse, or they filmed some of the internal scenes in like a sort of a bunker in another place in Nova Scotia.
Oh, that makes sense, yeah. Well, because if I'm not mistaken, they had I think it was something crazy like a 2-week or 3-week like filming production time on that island because of how hostile the climes were there. Like how difficult it was to film that kind of climate. They had like a very limited, I think partially due to time and money, but also health and safety, I think, like because of how horrible and like the weather was during that time. That was all like, as obviously not the destruction of the house, the sort of the Wookiee's house, but like the rest of it was all as it was. So
I mean, in interviews, the two of them talked about literally
how damp it is,
how hard the workday was when they were filming, but also that unlike sort of other actors and performers who work together and then sort of try and build this camaraderie around after the end of the shoot or at the end of like the workday, they were literally too exhausted to spend time with each other and would just get ready for the next day because it was so harsh to work in, because they're creating this illusion of this oncoming almost supernatural storm that's keeping them trapped there. So they have to work, if they want to achieve that as real as it can be realised in the drama of this film. I almost feel tired because I feel like I talk about performers a lot when we talk about films, but you have to discuss the sheer like tour de force performances that both are putting in.
Yeah, absolutely jaw-dropping performance from Dafoe. Obviously it's got absolutely no kind of comparison to him crawling on the floor as the Green Goblin mask is imposed over the top of him in Spider-Man 1 by Sam Raimi. But, it's close. No, I think it's probably my favourite Dafoe performance I can think of.
Whereas for Robert Pattinson,
This is his best performance.
Yeah, it definitely is. I have two things to say here. One of them is just like, if anyone says he can't act, show him this film, because Robert Pattinson, this is my hot take, if you like, for the film. Robert Pattinson displays, I think, every single human emotion physically possible in this film at some point.
He shows every human emotion during one of the scenes he has to have a wank in. like Pattinson as you could call it a protagonist role. I don't think it's the conventional one, but it's certainly, I think he's the kind of the narrative character that we follow as such.
He's the point of gravity for the film.
We map alongside the kind of journey to the nadir of his mental state, because we're already, when we meet Willem Dafoe, he's already in the depths of his own insanity. There are lots of themes we're going to unpack in this, lots of very specific, sort of hyper-focused themes. And you found quite a nice quote from Eggers about this, didn't you, Martin?
Yes, so when specifically being questioned about the homoeroticism in the film, which is one of the many things we'll unpick, he very, very deliberately said, I'm more about questions than answers in this movie, which I think really sums up what
he's accomplishing.
What he's accomplishing, is that you can take any number of things away from this and you'd be like, that's my core reading of this film, that's what I've taken away, and you'll have more than enough evidence to make your point.
So what, and I think the reason this works is the philosophical first principles I think this film is constructed from. So allow me to sound like an absolute wanker as I talk about Hegel for a minute, but the kind of core philosophical structure or conceit that's operating within this film, with these two people who both are revealed to actually be called Thomas, as Erith Winslow reveals his actual name is Thomas, but he's changed it because he murdered one of his friends. And the fact that they're both called Thomas, it's almost like Dafoe is playing an aged, more insane version of the archetype that Patterson's playing here. It's a very kind of obvious comparison to draw is that of Hegel's master-slave dialectic, where you have two opposing forces constantly battling each other. Be they ideas, be they people, be they concepts, be they armies or forces of history. One of them risks all of its life in one moment to gain dominance over the other thing, subjugates it, eventually realizes that its existence, through subjugating the other, the slave, as we call it, the master realizes that their existence has become dependent upon the slave, making their kind of existence almost contradictory in a certain sense, and the slave realizes that the basis of their existence is the work for their master, but it is creative, actual generating labor. It's not reliant, it's not parasitic in that sense. They are creating something and they are being leached off, and eventually they can come to realize that they actually have a kind of more inherent innate power over the master and can leverage that to eventually revolt and risk everything, and then the cycle kind of repeats itself again and again. And that's kind of, I think, the core that's operating in this film. We see it constantly in terms of Winslow being subjugated to the will and whims of the aged and crazed Thomas Wake. As Thomas Wake goes and sits in the top of the lighthouse whilst an unnamed eldritch horror does something to him in the evenings as Pattinson's recuperating from the day's work, and all the household chores he has to do in order, all the labour he has to accomplish for Thomas Wake. Eventually it ends, of course, with killing Thomas Wake, and that's kind of his kind of almost denouement before he reaches an apotheosis as he goes and finally sees what's at the top of the lighthouse, and his eyes get burnt out, and he's left scattered below, Prometheus style, with his insides torn out, being pecked by seagulls. This constant cycle of moving up and down, master, slave, enslavement, subjugation, this constant cycle. I think that as a kind of almost base principles, the core of it allows you to map loads of other different things onto that philosophical structure. So, for example, you picked up certainly a lot of the homoerotic elements of the film. Do you want to tell me a bit about them? Sort of, kind of to sketch out this thing I've just said.
So yeah, for me, I think the homoeroticism is probably the sort of the thing that struck me the most.
The most apparent thing.
The most apparent thing of the sort of many strands that you could go off with the Lighthouse. For me, I see the film almost as Ephraim Winslow or Thomas Lowe. I think I've forgotten his name.
Yeah. Thomas Wake is Defoe's character, and Ephraim Winslow is
Thomas Howard or
Pattinson.
Yeah. I see this film as Ephraim Winslow / Thomas Howard's almost like self not even self, like I can't even phrase it well. It's almost like a quest to accept his own aberrant sexuality, but
which fails
completely, because that's almost what the entire drama of this film is founded on for me.
Yeah.
Is this refusal of being subjugated and seen as effeminate. So he's doing all the hard work, but he sees them as chores, and he frames it almost as a husband and wife scenario. And there's one of the first sort of big confrontations. He demands that he's not treated as the housewife of the pair of them. He refuses that, and to literally apply the structure of this film as a sort of knowledge quest for an acceptance of this aberrant sexuality. The salty sea dog that Willem Dafoe plays occupies the mind space of the lighthouse, in that he's the one who controls whatever mystical thing it lives inside the lantern at the top, whereas Ephraim Winslow has to do all the work that makes sure that they can continue to live there and that the machine continues to operate. And he doesn't want that. He wants to occupy the top space. He wants to find out what's
the
there.
lighthouse keeper's role. So in this case, you're kind of framing this kind of acceptance almost as this eldritch surety of kind of what is, because the idea of eldritch or cosmic horror all comes from not knowing something, trying to find out something.
It's an encounter with another, and the other in this case is his almost his self that is accepting of who he is, because there's these moments of tenderness that come up, and there's one scene where they very deliberately almost kiss when they've gone.
And then they punch each other. So they almost kiss and they immediately hit each other.
They immediately reject him. He shoves Thomas Wake away from him, and they have to start fighting. And from that moment, the violence between them grows in intensity more and more, and the arguments are much worse than they were in the other parts of the film. So it's like more and more you're getting the sense that his masculinity and sexuality are being intertwined, and he's finding it more and more uncomfortable. It's why the masturbation scenes that only Pattinson has filmed, it's why I think they're really aggressively filmed. And what
do you think Defoe volunteered to film one? And they were like, Willem, that's not in the script. And he goes,
Willem,
oh, but
walked on set naked once, and they were like, "We don't need to see that." But in the same way, another sort of iconic moment in the film, if you like, is that just fits into this stream for me is the fact that the second masturbation scene, which is really at the peak of Pattinson's mania, he aggressively stabs and destroys this scrimshaw mermaid statue
this
that
fetish,
he's found.
this wooden fetish.
He describes a wooden fetish of a mermaid that he's having visions of and sexually gratifying himself to. He destroys that, and then at that point, they clash more and more. But then from that moment, you eventually get the point at which Defoe's character is reduced to crawling on all fours like a literal dog, and I think the dog animal is pretty deliberate there.
Yeah, well, it's obviously it's very deliberate, kind of the dog thing, but it's also cribbing from another kind of obvious draw from this film, which is Waiting for Godot, with the scenes of Lucky, who's led on a makeshift.
It's like a rope leash, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and then ends with Defoe doing this nonsensical diatribe as he dies, which is same as the 4-page monologue that Lucky has in Waiting for Godot. Very similar kind of sort of idea sort of going on in that. But yeah, you can also map notions of misogyny and hatred of women in this in terms of how, or like the notion of femininity in this film, because Defoe kind of reduces. So I'm not set. This is not me. This is not what I believe. I'm saying that Defoe kind of reduces Pattinson into this caricature of the womanly housewife doing all these laborious roles, and the only way that cycle ends is by Pattinson rising up and killing his master, in a sense.
And the only female presence in the film is this female mermaid who is seen as an aberrant,
purely as a sexual object.
Purely as a sexual and aberrant prospect.
But also this horrendous kind of like creature, siren of the sea, screeching. Like there's a very obvious kind of the classic notion of misogyny, treating women as both objects to be lusted after and objects to hate, as it were. And the fact that they aren't represented in this film, I think, is very deliberate choice to talk about.
Definitely.
The deconstruction, the kind of when men. This is the classic kind of idea that people say Lord of the Flies is a comment on society, when it's actually a comment on what a group of boys would do if they were put together on an island. A group of like privileged boys, but do together when put on an island. Similar way, the Lighthouse kind of takes this experiment of what would two fragile masculine egos do when placed in such close proximity with no other option. There's also elements of, like I said, the philosophical with that regard, but also like notions of class, obviously, in terms of that's easy to map onto Hegel's master-slave dialectic. It was done by little known sort of indie guy called Marx. I don't know if you heard of him.
Little bit.
He's a bit edgy, bit sort of on the. He's come back into fashion now, though. Recently, funnily enough.
These things always exist in cycles.
But the notion of class and the only way to break the cycle is to rise up, and then the idea of getting to, like, there's the kind of the bourgeois notion of social mobility under capitalism, in that one day I can work hard enough and earn enough money to become like the CEO billionaire Jeff Bezos. Don't worry, you can't redistribute his wealth for that reason. And so when you finally, if you become indoctrinated into that kind of bourgeois propaganda, however you want to call it, and you try to take that role for yourself, you will become brought back in. Oh, I hit my table then. I was gesturing. You become subsumed back into that same cycle.
The middle classes.
That kind of same cycle you try to break for yourself. If you have this individualist notion of it, you become subsumed straight back into it, in that sense. And it's like that's all kind of, I think, brought together by a lot of the mythological assertions and cycles that are brought through. I mean, both of us at uni, so this kind of our wheelhouse, we did a load on mythology, didn't we? It was kind of our big thing to do. There's a lot of quite overt mythological concepts being brought in here. So I wonder if you had anything to say about that.
I think the one that struck out for me is because I'm not that well versed in sort of Greek and ancient mythologies. The one that I'm most familiar with is this aberrant figure of the albatross from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So it's a bit more
Yes.
it's a bit more
Yeah.
recent mythology than perhaps the Protean
Yeah.
Protean
Well,
mythology.
this film takes really heavily from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I mean, Defoe himself occupies the role of the Ancient Mariner in a certain regard. And the idea of ghost ships on the sea that have these horrible creatures within them, kind of searching the lighthouse.
The most obvious
and there's also-
element being the seagull itself. So whilst in the original Samuel Taylor Coleridge poem, it's this albatross that's seen as this, and it's still now a suspicious figure at sea for a lot of people, that if you kill this sort of mythical bird, it'll visit great misfortune on you. And in one random fit of rage that Ephraim is constantly being tormented by these seagulls, he just, in a really horrifying scene, beats this seagull to a pulp out of pure frustration. And at that point, we start to see
the heavens break.
And this storm is visited upon them, this supernatural...
And like you said about the Samuel Taylor Coleridge poem, like that kind of... The precipitation of the mariner's kind of wrath comes from the killing of the sea, or the death of the seagull. And it's a cycle that repeats again. It repeats even today. In 14th of March 2019, there's an article in the Evening Standard about a man fined after killing a seagull that tried to eat his chips. So really, the Lighthouse has never been more relevant than in the modern day.
That's what you need to take away from this. Seagulls
Man
are
has been
bastards.
fined after killing a seagull in front of horrified children and it tried to steal its chips. I think the article, the subhead is meant to say as it tried to steal its chips, but they've written and. So there's the old sort of sailor's tale that if the seagull dies, it's a precipitation of bad things to come, and he's warned, and Winslow's warned about this, but kind of like with this. And these kind of the first ideas you get that the Wake might not just be mad, but he has some sort of foreknowledge or forbidden knowledge that Winslow is not privy to, because he correctly predicts that killing the seagull will precipitate the storm and these things going wrong, and as such they do. There's also the obvious mythological assertion at the end, which we mentioned briefly before, which is after he goes up to the top of the lighthouse after killing Thomas Wake, Erefin Winslow, looks upon the visage of the lighthouse. You hear him scream, and his scream doesn't just peak the microphone, it peaks so loud that it becomes nothing but pure compression. So there's previously really heavily, as a film that has really heavy focus on audio-visual verisimilitude and all these different kind of ways of building this very particular time reference, and sort of location, even with its boxed off camera. Suddenly the exposure, it turns to max, and the compression on that screen goes crazy. So they use these elements of modern filmmaking in terms of amping up exposure in post, and sort of like by peeking out microphones. Like if I was to scream in this microphone, I won't now because I'd have to edit it later and I don't want to. But this notion of like using audio-visual techniques from now, like using this forbidden knowledge of the future from when this is being filmed to kind of do this kind of eldritch knowledge gathering moment. It was a really impressive choice, I thought, and then it ends with Winslow abandoned at the bottom with and they transpose the Greek myth of Prometheus, the man who tried to steal the sun and steal fire for the for men below. Winslow in this moment if we have this master-slave dialectic reading going on where he's representing some class or concept or idea, he tries to bring this knowledge back down to his level, and his eyes are burnt to pulp, and seagulls, and so it's transposed as this kind of this New England or like sort of sailor's tale setting, as rather than crows picking out his guts, it's instead these seagulls reaching there. And you see again the myth of Sisyphus is expanded upon in throughout the thing, with these repeated shots of Winslow hefting these rocks up in a wheelbarrow or over his shoulder up the hill towards the Wiki's house, and then occasionally all of that will crumple down to the bottom of the hill and he has to pick it all back up again. So this idea of the myth of Sisyphus and this uninterrupted, ungaining labour is also pushed throughout the film in terms of like the idea of kind of the futility you see in a lot of these eldritch cosmic horror stories.
I think it's really interesting that it engages with cosmic horror so much, but realistically, most of the mythology that's present is not Lovecraftian in itself. So
I agree.
What I mean is that it seems to borrow the trappings of what would be sort of a very typical Lovecraft story.
You have like the obviously it has elements of Shadow of Innsmouth with these kind of fish creatures that appear in it, and it has elements of At the Mountains of Madness as well in certain regards. It returns like the idea of this reaching lighthouse that you can't quite access the peak of, and also elements of Call of Cthulhu and kind of how that's the kind of creatures under the sea, and the sea is this big kind of theme. And also the kind of more lower key tale, The Rats in the Walls, where this kind of sound, these things coming around the house is a very like oppressive part of the story. But like you say, it kind of borrows that storytelling mode, but it uses other things to populate its myth.
I guess the best way to describe it is probably a very literate text, I think.
Yeah, very a literary text.
A literary text, yeah. It's drawing from all these different themes. I think if you look hard enough, you can also see, although it's based very loosely on an Edgar Allan Poe short story,
Yes.
the elements of that through the drafting procedure were sort of mainly taken out, but you can still see those elements. I mean,
It's more the tone, kind of the black and whites and the darknesses you see in it.
It's the texture of the piece rather than the narrative.
Yeah.
But also,
You can see the inspiration. Yeah.
the way that seagull manifests is just as much the raven as it is anything else. It is a constant, malevolent, annoying presence.
It's a theme of Eggers's work in general, because there's a very particular use of animals and kind of animalistic ideas in The Witch as well, which I think you'll probably enjoy that a bit more because it's shorter. There's a really great character in that plays upon those notions. So
it's the goat,
it's kind of a
isn't it?
theme Eggers seems to be quite obsessed with. And also being scared of wanking as well. That's one that comes up in The Witch as well.
If we've learned one thing, it's masturbation is terrifying.
Eggers has cited Carl Jung as a very major influence on the movie, and his ideas of cycles of primal desires that emerge throughout a collective unconscious of people. And that's definitely, you can see that in the kind of shared mania between the two of them. And that shared kind of homoerotic conflict you see throughout it.
Ooh, that was heavy.
Yes, sorry, it definitely was.
Very dense.
On a lighter note, let's move on to the categories.
I've noticed these. This is we've got some awards here to give out.
We've got the awards here. So, well, one of the things Robert Pattinson picked up from the script, he thought it was about alcoholism, which you could definitely see, like a struggle with drink and addiction. And in the film, the two of them get absolutely stocious throughout.
Oh, they're absolutely trolleyed.
Trolleyed is it? I like that one. Absolutely trolleyed. So this category is the Absolute Liability Award. So this is given to the actor you'd least like to have to get shit-wit drunk with on a night out with them. Awarded for one particular horrid action they do whilst pissed in this movie.
Oh, who would I... So I'm trying to think in terms of this movie, because I would definitely stray towards a Willem Dafoe, just because I'd want to watch whatever he does. Whatever he does when he's drunk.
Would be great.
I think the thing that sticks with me the most about this film is I reckon that Robert Pattinson, of the two of them, is more likely to be the one who comes up to you.
The absolute liability.
Oh, I love you, and have those really intense emotional moments where you're like, okay, let's just... It's fine.
I agree with you from a different angle to this, because you know how there's always the asshole at a party who the white guy brings an acoustic guitar and ruins the party.
Yeah.
I think Rob Pattinson would be that guy, but it'd be with the sea shanty dance that he does. He'd get up in the middle of it and start doing his sea shanty and like kicking up a fuss about all that.
Oh, and the banging on the table and doing the piss off.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. You'd be like, piss off.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It's definitely Robert Pattinson.
For that reason, yeah, but I think, yeah, exactly. So I think the Absolute Liability Award goes to Robert Pattinson for being too much of a messy drunk. Too much of a messy bitch while he's drunk. Okay.
So our second award is the Pub Quizzical Award, which we're giving to the best piece of film trivia that you found, and I'm reading verbatim again, on a half-arsed Google search.
Yeah, so I just did a little Google about some fun trivia about the films. I've got two kind of contenders. You know the bit where he is dancing around and sort of speaking in tongues when he's drunk?
Dance, Winslow! Dance! Come on, you like the Winslow here? How are we going to the wood last here? Into the same we just started.
That's actually an entire sea shanty that he delivers within 30 seconds. So it's the entire lyrics of a full, of like 3-minute sea shanty that he delivers in the space of 3 seconds, whilst doing a heavily choreographed and very specific Irish jig, a specific kind of jig that he'd learnt for this film, and Eggers didn't film his feet during it, even though he was told he would. So all these spins and stuff, they're choreographed to like a dance he's learnt specifically for this moment, with really complex feet movements, and the camera's never on his legs once in the film, in this bit. So that's one piece of fun trivia I found. The other one is that The Lighthouse is based on a true story of two Welsh wickies, both called Thomas, one with a particularly dark past that led him to eventually murder his lighthouse mate, the older wiki, due to various different reasons, because they get locked together during a huge storm. And the tale goes that he ended up building a coffin for the older man, and then killing him and putting him in it, and then the wind destroyed the coffin. Oh. Is how the story... Originally it was like an island off the coast of Wales, like a couple of centuries ago. And that's what allegedly the story is based upon.
Interesting.
So which is more fun, do you think? That Robert Pattinson got cucked out of showing off his cool Irish jig moves, or the fact it's a true story based on some real psychopaths called Thomas who offed each other in a storm?
I mean, I think it's definitely got to be the true story one, because that narrative sounds just...
Also, I would have loved it if the kind of the box quote for The Lighthouse was two arseholes called Thomas off themselves in a storm. That would have been a much better box quote.
So, I agree with you that I think it's the true story one. I have also found two that I would like to put forward for the award.
Okay, yeah.
Two moments of trivia.
Excited.
So, moment of trivia number one. Piece of trivia number one. Moment of trivia. There. Piece of trivia number one.
Welcome to Martin's Moments of Trivia. On Dave. For the first time ever.
Piece of trivia number one. When asked to describe the movie, Robert Eggers always used the same choice of words in every interview, and the quote goes as follows. Nothing good can happen when two men are trapped alone in a giant phallus. That's
okay.
That's piece of trivia number one. The other one, sure, which I think is fun, is Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe's facial hair for the movie was all real. However, Pattinson had to dye his mustache dark because he's naturally blonde, and Dafoe's bad teeth were a prosthetic.
So that's actually 3 fun facts there. Oh, almost 4 fun facts in one go. Wow. Absolute star. I should really consult you about these things before the day we start recording. We'd almost get a better podcast out of that. I think the fact that his one stock response in interviews is two men chilling in a penis, 5 people heart because they're not gay is kind of the best the best one about that. I think that takes the Pub Quizzical Award for best piece of trivia. That'd be my vote.
I'm very happy to see it go that way, because when I found the IMDb trivia page for The Lighthouse and read that, I was like, nothing else will ever be better than this.
And do you know what really upsets me? The fact that we looked at the same page and I didn't find as interesting a fact as you did. So what's going to happen now is we're going to go to a lighthouse in Wales going, I'm going to murder you.
Oh God, we've got the same name as well.
Yeah. I didn't even think about that. That's fun. So my next category is recasts. Who else could you see cast in these roles, and what kind of a film might that have been?
Interesting.
I'm gonna pitch something to you now.
Go on.
I think it'll be interesting. Okay. Let me just think for 1 second. So. Mark Ruffalo as the younger.
Okay.
And Stellan Skarsgård as the older.
Interesting.
That makes it a very different movie.
Very different.
Probably in Iceland.
Do you have a reason why in particular, or just those two?
I think Stellan Skarsgård. Skarsgård is cast in the upcoming Eggers film The Norseman, set to release in 2022, I think.
Okay.
So him, Anna Taylor-Joy, who is in The Witch, and Willem Dafoe are all set to star in this film.
Interesting.
Called The Norseman. I'm not exactly sure what that film is, but I'm very excited to see it nevertheless. But yeah, so I just think he'd be quite an interesting figure in that regard. Also, I'll pitch one to you based on a film we both loved recently. Will Ferrell as the younger and Pierce Brosnan as the older. Based on a really dark reimagining of the Eurovision Song Contest
and
movie.
they're still both doing their dodgy Icelandic accents.
Well, obviously they are. Do you have any thoughts if you might recast it? Who you might cast in the various roles? It's really hard, I think, to think of anyone apart from the two that are in it as those characters because they so embody the roles. But I was wondering if you have any.
Yeah, so I sat and looked at this one and thought about this for a while, and I genuinely don't think I would put someone else in the younger Winslow position. However, I do have a pitch for a very different sea captain performance.
Okay,
for Thomas Wake.
If you say Jack Sparrow, I'm not going to be impressed.
No, don't worry. So, I would put forward for a very different, more precise, calm and collected sort of antithesis to the young youthful mania.
I'm going to try and predict.
Yeah, go on.
John Hamm?
Yes, John Hamm.
But why John Hamm?
So for me, a lot of the
I mean, both him and Willem Dafoe have big penises, so they've got that going for them.
That's half the battle, really. For me, I think John Hamm does his best performance, not like a specific performance, but his best performances are always really calm and constricted and sort of in-control personas that at one point give way to such like an unbridled violence or like vengeance in them. So for me, I'm thinking about him in Baby Driver. In that, he's very sort of slick and cool and calm and collected, and for the most of the film, the moment his wife is murdered or dies in a shootout with the police, he becomes this constant negative force that's sort of just demonic and really just embodies an evil presence and really sort of tamps down on some innate violence that exists at some level that I think you would get. Obviously, it would be a very different film if you cast him against this Robert Pattinson.
But it would be less of this deranged mania, more like this slow.
Yeah,
he'd be a very charismatic wiki that maybe Winslow would confide more information in, and then
I think it would be
start
far
to see
more,
that turning on him.
it would be far more openly manipulative, almost. I think.
Yeah, I can see, and it would be so rather than him demand he do these things and the salty sea dog kind of captain thing, and he sort of like more turns it into this sort of manipulator, like, oh, you want to do this for me, do you?
Yeah, I think there'd be a lot more bargaining with whatever is at the top of the lighthouse rather than being like, no, I own the light itself. That's what my job is here for. I think there'd be a lot more sort of, maybe I'll let you get up there and see the light. The inside the presence up there, encounter it. If you do all of these things for me, that sort of thing. I think he'd be almost like a tempter figure, and I think it'd be quite interesting.
That sort of this, almost like this eldritch agent who like has been, rather than this kind of like unchained, paranoia and confusion and sort of orgasmic fantasia that Willem Dafoe's performance gives it. This kind of enrapturement he has, but this protection of it, more like a. Do this, and maybe see like a more specific kind of end to it, like a more
potentially.
It maybe had end with more of a direction. I don't know how well that would necessarily work. Again, like I said, it'd be a very different film. There'd be a meaning to it. It'd be pointed towards a certain thing, I think. But yeah, I mean that's a really good. But you'd keep Pattinson as.
I think you have to. I really can't figure out any other actor who could fill the same role. It would have to be someone who's given into more sort of fringe acting. Potentially, I could see in that specific diagram against John
Jesse
Hamm.
Eisenberg.
Not just no. I just like Jesse Eisenberg.
Lex Luthor.
Potentially, I could see maybe Daniel Radcliffe take it up. He's taking a lot more sort of radical.
It's an incredibly Radcliffe role. It's very Daniel Radcliffe. You're right. Yeah, definitely. That I think is the only. And considering like their acting chops, I think he's the only one who can maybe. I don't think he'd maybe do as good a job as Pattinson, but he's been really good at like in the Woman in Black. He was fantastic in. So I can definitely see him taking on this kind of a role.
And he's definitely used to sort of more fringe and darker and stranger performances, thinking like Equus when he was in the stage play Equus.
Yeah, definitely. And like it'd be a very similar kind of role, I think, as his role in Equus maybe. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Brilliant. So yeah, I like that recasting. So we'll say Daniel Radcliffe and John Hamm. Yeah, that's really cool. I like that. That's a really weird film we've just made up. So what do you think is the best scene in the film, Martin?
In the sort of the violent second masturbation scene that cuts between this really aggressive and then the mermaid and sex with the mermaid, and it's this really violent smashing of editing, just cutting
alongside the crashing of the furnace that he's feeding the coals into, or the coals are going into.
It's a collapsing convergence of everything that's going on in the film in terms of.
Well, it's kind of the breaking point.
Yeah,
for
and I think that's a fantastic way of capturing a conscious collapse, if you like.
Oh, definitely, and like after that point, if I'm not mistaken, he conspires to get Thomas Wake really, really drunk so he can get kind of the upper hand on him. Like I think you're right in kind of this kind of moment of cracking almost of a consciousness. I think that's a really that's a really good contender, I think, for that.
It's very difficult to describe what actually happens in that scene.
Yeah,
it is kind of one that you just have to witness, but it is good.
Yeah,
it's very good.
For me, I think in terms of establishing a tone and an aesthetic mood, just the opening. Yeah, I think it's actually the first argument they have when he refuses to drink the white. Is it ethanol or is it rum? I can't remember. Like whatever white sailors. I think it might be a rum or like some sort of spirit.
It's a rum at that point, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. This spirit he's trying to get him to drink, and when he refuses to do that, and they have this kind of contrasting sort of point of views at the very start of it, whilst they're having this first meal together. I think.
Should pale death with treble dread make the ocean caves our bed, God, who hears the surges roll, deign to save our suppliant soul. To 4 weeks.
No, sir, thank you.
Bad luck to leave a toast unfinished, lad.
Well, meaning no disrespect.
Man, what don't drink best have his reasons.
I think that's the acting is just through the roof in that particular scene. Like I think, in terms of like work done to establish a mood, I don't think any two actors have done anything better with a kind of aesthetic kind of framing like that. I just think it's so. As much as they're great, I'm a sucker for a mad Nicolas Cage like shouting moment in a film, especially when Willem Dafoe does it, of course. But you can't get better than that.
Definitely not.
That kind of that table setting that they do there, and it's just so beautiful. And when you watch it, you sort of realise you're watching two fantastic actors give probably their best performances ever.
Oh,
I think
easily, yeah. It captures.
I think that's
the
best acting in that film is at the very start when you establish both of them as very distinctly and differently human. Yeah. What's the best line, or we can say monologue, because there's a lot of monologues in this film.
The best line or monologue in the film.
I'll give you some contenders. Era from Winslow's. You think you're so damn
so goddamn high and mighty just because you're a goddamn lighthouse keeper? Well, you ain't a captain of no ship, and you never was. You ain't no general. You ain't no copper. You ain't the president, and you ain't my father. And I'm sick of you acting like you is. Sick of you laughing, snoring, You goddamn farts! You goddamn farts! You smell like piss. You smell like jism. Like rotten dick. Like curdled foreskin. Like hot onions fucked a farmyard shithouse. And I'm sick of your smell. I'm sick of it. I'm sick of it, you goddamn drunk, you goddamn no account, son of a bitch, bastard liar. That's what you are. You're a goddamn drunken, horse-shitting, short shit liar.
Followed by the best line, which is, "You have a way with words, Tommy."
I'm glad you read that out, because that's the moment that I leapt to in my head was this. It contrasts lovely to the bombast that Willem Dafoe has throughout the entire film. This just moment of really puerile compounding, like, scatological degradation against him.
Completely unstructured. Like, you have this beautiful, haunting, scary monologue about the Sea King engorging your organs and stuff, and he just goes, "You fucking son of a bitch, bastard liar." You drunken horse-shitting short shit liar.
This is like a verbal diarrhea of all the horrible things that come into his mind that he describes him as, that he's worse than piss and shit and vomit and everything else. I think that's the best sort of delivery for me.
I think in general, Willem Dafoe gets the best lines in the script by far and away. Like, doldrums, evil and the devil, boredom makes men to villains, and water goes quick, lad, vanished. The only medicine is drink, keeps them sailors happy, keeps them agreeable, keeps them calm. Like, these really haunting lines. And I think the best monologue he gives is by far and away that one you said towards. So actually, there's also a theme in in Egger's work of male sort of antagonistic figures giving their final monologue prayers to some sort of god whilst had dirt shoveled into their mouth. It happens in The Witch as well. Which I think you'll enjoy when you see it, because this guy does this like prayer about witches where he's like putting dirt into his own mouth as he does it. But the fact that Defoe delivers this monologue, which is what protean forms swim up from men's minds and melt in hot Promethean plunder, scorch the eyes of divine shames and horror. It's the most Lovecraftian line, I think, in the text. It's actually particularly reminiscent of a line which is a paragraph which is the epigraph for the start of the Dunwich Horror, that from a Charles Lamb essay called Witches and Other Night Fears, where Charles Lamb espouses this almost platonic theory of horror and where these horrible images of the things that we fear come from. He goes, Gorgons, Hydras and Chimeras, the dire stories of Selenio and the Harpies may reproduce themselves in the brains of superstition, but they were there before. They are transcripts, types, the archetypes are in us and eternal. How else should the recital of that and we know an awakened sense to be false come to affect us all? Names whose sense we fear not, frayers of things that be not. So it's this kind of idea of this primordial assertion of the latent horror within humanity and the fears we have. That I love, what he's living whilst being shoveled to death, basically, with dirt, bleeding out from this beating he's taken from Winslow, and it's like mutable and unchanging as the she who girdles round the globe, them's truth. It's just absolutely brilliant, like, writing.
I'd love to take
in general.
I'd love to take, if I could, like, get the script of the film and look at it in terms of the poetic rhythms of what Defoe's character's speech is patterned like, and see where it contrasts and can be mapped into all these different literary moments that we've talked about in the episode. Because
definitely. Cause, sorry, Karen.
His speech really thrums with this sort of ancient, powerful force, which contrasts with this very New England sort of very specific dialect that Pattinson picks up from the period that the entire film is based on. Whereas there's this long, languishing speech of ancient curses and maledictions and everything else that Defoe comes out with. It's very powerful and it is poetic. That's the best word for it.
Yeah. it's beautifully written poetry at the end of the day as well. These kind of, and especially like the contrasts in the language as well, like you've mentioned. It's just absolutely beautiful stuff.
Definitely.
So yeah, I think and I want to ask for the final question before we finish this film. Finish this episode. Is one what I like to do when films like it's lucky that we're doing a lot of like co-protagonists in. For you, who wins the film? I have this as the ultimate showdown of two grotty boys, Defoe and Pattinson. Who do you think wins the film? Who gives the most? Obviously, it's not a case of winning a film, but who, for you, gives the best performance for them? Who's the most compelling? I think we're gonna have the same answer here.
I think it's Pattinson.
I was about to say we count down and do it, but yeah, you're right. It's Pattinson. No, it's Pattinson. It's Pattinson.
Yeah.
Pattinson is the heart of this film. He gives it direction. He gives it this kind of forward momentum. As much as I love Defoe in everything he does, pretty much, and in this he's incredible, and it wouldn't have the same manic texture that it has without him. I think there's no way. There's no way this film would work without.
Defoe's not the linchpin of this film. If the centre of gravity was Defoe's character, then a lot of the things it wants to do would probably still work, but not necessarily as well. What I would simply sum it up is that you need Defoe's mystery and mysticism in the film in order to make it as engrossing and atmospheric and interesting as it is.
Absolutely, definitely, yeah.
If the sort of the image that we get of him occasionally naked in the actual with the light,
in the lighthouse, the top of the lighthouse, it said.
If we spent time in that scene rather than allied with Pattinson seeing it as a spectator being like, "What the fuck is that?"
Yeah, where it's almost him being doubled as Defoe.
Yes, the
horror of it wouldn't impart without the kind of base point of the sense of the mind we get from him.
Exactly.
So that's... I think that's all I have to say about The Lighthouse. I've definitely got more to say about it.
I will almost certainly have more to say about The Lighthouse when I watch it again, which is something I definitely will do now.
Yeah, we should rewatch it. We should rewatch it together at some point. Maybe give it a couple of weeks, a week or two, before you rewatch it, and then go back to it. I'd like to end on a little quote from... that I was going to talk about in the thing, but I think we sort of went past. I forgot to mention it at the time, but I think a quote from a philosopher called Julia Kristeva. She talks a lot about. She's got an essay, a brilliant essay on horror fiction called "The Powers of Horror: An Essay on Abjection." It's about the philosophical note of us, the other, and what repulsion means to horror. She has this idea of our reactions to things that repulse us, things like retching, these movements we make. We expunge and expel ourselves outwards in this kind of act of self-annihilation that I guess you see reflected at the end of the film where Winslow or Howard, whoever he is, gets the eldritch horror or knowledge of the lighthouse that completely annihilates him. We expunge ourselves outwards in ways like retching, and like this film was full of vomit and piss and all these different kind of things that are coming out of the body, which kind of plays into this. So she characterizes her idea of abjection like this. There looms within abjection one of those violent dark revolts of being, directed against a threat that seems to emanate from an exorbitant outside or inside, ejected beyond the scope of the possible, the tolerable, the thinkable. If the object, however, through its opposition, settles me within the fragile texture of a desire for meaning, which, as a matter of fact, makes me ceaselessly and infinitely homologous to it, what is abject, on the contrary, the jettisoned object is radically excluded and draws me toward the place where meaning collapses. And I think that's a really good paragraph. Just in general, it's a really well-written paragraph, but especially when thinking about what this film accomplishes and how it works with horror and trauma and kind of melancholy, I think, especially. So yeah, on that really dour note, I'll cut in a joke here we make earlier about jizz or something like that to make it funny. I've been Martin. Sorry, he's been Martin.
He's also been Martin.
and I've never once done that correctly.
There's the bit.
We'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, nice one.
That was meaty.
He's the protagonist of this film.
Pattinson. His name's not Patterson, it's Pattinson.
Is it Pattinson?
Yeah, his name's Robert Pattinson.
Yep, it is. Cool. I mean, what we could have done is you could have just not mentioned anything, and people would have just always missed out the end. But now I've got to go. Now it's there. So that's good.
It's fine. Just cut this bit out and just roll with it. It's all right.
It's great. It's great. But you're gonna hear Robert Pattinson in post from now on. I'll clip you saying his surname and I'll paste it over every time I've said it wrong. We've got a lot of bits that are just shite chatting that are in hot competition to go on the end of the podcast that no one listens to.